Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar hosted by the Philos Project and our allies at Save Armenia. Today is the remembrance of the Armenian Genocide that happened in the early 20th century, and we have here experts which will be able to share a range of the history, the geopolitics of what the setup was that led to that tragedy, as well as practical ways that Christians now should understand the issue and support people. I'm joined today by Simone Riscala, Andrew Dorn, and Dan Hare, all employees of the Philos Project, and Dan as well helps lead our Save Armenia initiative. And to open this, I'm also joined by my infant daughter briefly, so thank you for bearing with us. And I would love to start off by kicking it over to Simone to share a little bit about her background, the Armenian people, and some history of the diaspora, and the significance of this date.
Thank you, Isaac. It's great to be here with all of you. I'm always really moved when people show up for things that have to do with Armenia and Armenians. So today, April 24th, is the anniversary of the date, April 24th, 1915, where Armenian intellectuals and leaders were rounded up in Constantinople and Istanbul, and that launched what became the first genocide of the 20th century, the Armenian Genocide in 1915, where 1.5 million people lost their lives. This Genocide Remembrance Day, this one in particular, is of, I don't know, it's not, I don't want to say more meaningful, but it's particularly meaningful because of what happened last year, 2023, in September, which marked the end of what was the ethnic cleansing of 120,000 Armenians in a region known as the Nagorno-Karabakh, or Artsakh in Armenian. That happened after 10 months of a blockade and starvation of that region that has been populated by Armenians since before Armenians were Christians. And as an Armenian, I feel very privileged to be part of a people who were the first official Christians in the world. Armenia declared itself a Christian nation in 301 AD, which is about a decade before the Roman Empire not made Christianity legal, but just legalized Christianity. So this event is because of Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day, but also was kind of sparked by an article that my colleague and friend Andrew Dorn wrote called Today the Jews, Tomorrow You, which I don't know if you've read it, maybe we can put it in the chat. It did go out in the invitation email, that article. But that phrase, today the Jews, tomorrow you, is a phrase that was told to my Armenian grandmother in Cairo, Egypt in the 1970s when we went to war with Israel. And I bring that up because again, when that article was written last fall, we were already very much attuned to the rising rates of anti-Semitism in the country and on college campuses. And this week in particular, we saw a lot of that going on in the Ivy Leagues. So I'm very happy to be here to talk about Armenia, Israel, America, the West, and how all these things are important and how they all fit together. I had the privilege last year when we were dealing with the crisis of Artsakh and the Nagorno-Karabakh to work with Dan Hare on a project called Save Armenia that was incubated at the Philos Project and which has now become its own nonprofit. So Dan, I know I don't want to steal your thunder here since you've been quite heroic in making that initiative happen.
Thanks, Simone. Yeah, no, it was such a privilege to get to sort of work on that together with you. For those joining us, Philos has been tracking Armenia for quite a while. It was about a year ago when that engagement really started to ramp up, and that was in large part due to the blockade that Simone referenced to this ancient region of Artsakh. This is a really meaningful region for Armenians. It's where their alphabet was developed. In a lot of ways, you can think of it as the Armenian version of Judea and Samaria. And so one of our first big efforts doing the Armenia initiative within Philos was this trip, bringing this delegation of Christian and Jewish leaders to Armenia to be on the ground and see what was happening there. That was in June of last year. Following that, it became clear that the initiative was big enough to warrant the creation of a new organization. So Philos, in partnership with the Tufankian Foundation, launched Save Armenia, a Judeo-Christian alliance. And so I moved from Philos over to Save Armenia. We very much see ourselves as sister organizations. And, Armenia, as Simone said, is the oldest Christian nation in the world. It is the last Christian nation in the Middle East. And so with Philos's mission of positive Christian engagement in the Near East, it just made sense that Philos would be a part of launching this really important initiative. It is relatively new. Website just went live, I think, 2 weeks ago, but we have a lot in the works, future delegations planned. And our work at Save Armenia is dedicated to raising support for Armenians among Americans, specifically among three key groups. So Christians, conservatives, and then Jews. And we actually see the Jewish people, both American Jews and Israeli Jews, as really critical allies in this effort. As Simone said, her grandma was told, today the Jews, tomorrow you. And Armenians and Jews share history and values, but also threats. They share a profound biblical history. They share a history of suffering. Both have experienced genocide on a massive scale. In fact, Hitler, when planning the Holocaust, famously said, who today, after all, remembers the annihilation of the Armenians? And so to think that this threat that the Jewish people are facing is not going to bleed into, spaces where Christian minorities will be threatened, I think is naive. And so we think it's critical to partner with our Jewish friends because we have sort of the same struggle, as it were.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate that. And I want to kick it over to Andrew now to have you explain a little more of the history and the geopolitics of the current threats that are being faced by Armenia and some of the diaspora as well. And maybe a little bit of the history of that region can be complicated for people when they hear about an Armenian Republic, but not in Armenia, and how that plugs into the priorities that Americans and American Christians in particular should care about.
Thanks, Isaac. First, picking up where Dan left off a little bit, I would say that it is very important for Christians in America and in the West to really have some understanding of just how the oldest Christian nation in the world managed to survive, but just how very close it was after suffering genocide when Armenian refugees regathered in northeastern Anatolia and then made their way to the Caucasus, to ancient Armenia, where Armenians had lived for thousands of years. There were still extant communities there. They fought in the spring of 1918, May 1918, what's come to be known as the Battle of Sardarabad. Though outnumbered and against a better equipped Turkish army that had invaded Armenia, they fought and defeated over just over a week's time the Turkish army that had come to essentially annihilate the Armenians, and there would be almost no sense that of Armenians today around the world. They would be a people without any roots. You can imagine if you're Irish or Polish or Italian or Greek, if your country simply ceased to exist, it's kind of to erase memory in a sense and to erase your history. And that does happen to to nations, to civilizations, to entire groups of people. It nearly happened to the Jewish people in the last century. It nearly happened to the Armenians. So the fact that both nations were reforged in the modern era by the skin of their teeth is not a small thing. And that both are minorities in a predominantly Muslim region is not a minor point either. There would not be the genocidal impulse against both nations by some of their neighbors were they not respectively Christian and Jewish. And just a quick note on that point, I've spent much of the last 15 years either in public service at the State Department, working on these issues from as a public servant, or in civil society, either in NGO work with In Defense of Christians or with the Philos Project, or doing freelance journalism, covering much of this region and a lot of these issues. And there are very complicated realities that states face. They live in the world of realpolitik. And much of that is dictated by interest and geography and culture and history and alliances and a lot of some very hard facts, some fluid facts. But the geography of Armenia complicates their situation immensely. They have a very perilous situation for the foreseeable future, and they have a couple of very hostile enemies in Turkey and Azerbaijan. Meanwhile, their allies or their natural partners are Iran and Russia, which is the sort of thing that in the Middle East people understand that states have to make deals with unsavory characters. Americans typically have less patience and tolerance for that. And Americans also don't have a great understanding of where their government has meddled around the world and how people don't necessarily like that we might undermine democracy in their country while we're talking about democracy. They might not like that the United States has been a close partner with a government like Saudi Arabia, which has an abysmal human rights record and has been in the past a supporter of violent extremism around the world. But at the moment, they're a partner and they are necessary in this larger regional struggle at the moment. And Israel is an ally. And Israel spent many years looking at the United States and looking at some of our partners and saying, you understand that the people you're partnering with, the people you're sending petrol dollars to, are funding the PLO. And that created tensions, but the Israelis understand this. In a similar way, I think Israelis and Armenians understand that there is the US government, which is going to be cold, impersonal, even antisocial in the pursuit of what it regards as its interests. And then there are the American people who exist in civil society, and Americans ought to see this sort of thing the same way. And to be sure, there are many Israelis I've heard discuss how they don't love all of Israel's regional strategic partnerships. And this is also worth remembering that America still has some of these unsavory partnerships around the world, despite the fact that we don't really need to. We have the luxury of indulging in our values, whatever they may be, or seemingly evolving set of values that we're intent on exporting around the world and holding others to. Israelis and Armenians don't have that luxury. They live in a world, they live in very tough realities. And so just to close out, I would say I'm very proud of the fact that the Philos Project is the only organization I'm aware of in the world that has chosen to be an advocate for both Christians in the Middle East and the people of Israel, the nation of Israel. And it's very hard to do both, and we get a lot of scrutiny for that. from some corners, but we are not a government. We don't take government money, and so we do have the freedom to do this very hard thing, which is to on April 24th remember the Armenian Genocide, and at the same time look at the events that are taking place at Columbia University and other universities in America, and be troubled by the anti-Semitism, to look at what Hamas is doing, what Iran is doing in the region, and condemn it with moral clarity. And for that, I'm grateful. So,
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I wanted to open this up to all of you, but to address, I think there's a strain of American thought now, even among Christians somewhat, that will look at social problems in the US and decline of morality, cultural connections, a range of issues, and sense a reasonable apprehension at basically looking outside of our own shores. Basically, we have all these issues. If you look at the functioning or lack of functioning of Congress and other government bodies, I think we can sympathize with somebody who just feels fatigue at it, that basically, it's a tragedy that this genocide happened and this small country is facing these threats, but what can we do about it? Do we have any capacity? So I wonder if you guys could address that kind of at the sentiment level of maybe just exhaustion and how biblically Christians should think about our posture, our varying levels of responsibility that exist. I think in the concept of subsidiarity, we would agree, starting in our closest proximity to our family, communities, states, countries, but also I think what duties we have to both care about and morally process issues happening to other people. And then the other further question of, advocate for them, support our government's soft or hard power ability to support them. So I wonder if you guys could address that.
yeah. I hope you'll forgive me for going first. The first thing I would say is that I understand why people might, on biblical or moral grounds, object in principle to U.S. intervention or meddling here or there overseas, and I can see how they might support it using the same Bible or the same or a similar set of moral precepts. So that's a difficult one. I don't know if there's anything inherently evil about either isolationism or imperialism. Both can be just. I don't know that it's the purpose of the state of states to be moral. I think it's their purpose to be just, to strive for justice, and much of the time they'll fall short of that. But I don't think of the state as being. I don't think it can be sanctified, so to speak. And so that does present Christians with a little bit of a conundrum. I think there is certainly we could refer to Walter Russell Mead's prism of the four American temperaments, and there is the Wilsonian do-gooder around the world, but that has not fared well, especially over the last 25 years, which is part of the reason many Americans are not joining the military. It's only one part of the reason, but that is part of it. There's a lot of reluctance to engage around the world, and I agree that is a problem, because we have burdens as a great power, if not the indispensable great power in the world. But there is a sense of exhaustion, and I think that is reflected across much of the country. But that's because I think we have failed to have success that we really might have had we relied on diplomacy instead of military intervention. That's a longer conversation, but that is I think a large part of the fatigue. And at the same time, we do have, as a quasi-imperial power, we have a lot of interests to protect. We want to protect interests at home. We want to protect economic interests as well as national security interests, and that does require America having a significant presence in the world, and that presence in the world is ultimately underwritten by military power. And some people would prefer that to be naval power rather than um, troops on the ground. Some would prefer that we adopt a more defensive posture. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that, but I do think we can't always, even if we know what the right thing is, there's no guarantee what the consequences will be undertaking any course of action. And the law of unintended consequences always follows war. And that's a lesson that we've learned. So I think this is a large part of what we are seeing in Americans today, with a great reluctance to become involved overseas. And at the same time, there's no doubt that we do have responsibilities around the world that will advance and protect our interests. It's a hard question.
I'll say too, I can understand that sentiment that folks, you know, they don't want to get involved overseas because, like Andrew said, the last 25 years in Iraq and Afghanistan have gone horribly wrong. I mean, I am originally from and still live in my hometown of St. Louis, which is a Rust Belt town. And the last few decades have not been good to the Rust Belt. I mean, industry has gone overseas. There's a decent amount of poverty. And I think, when people hear our government say, hey, we want to invest more blood and treasure in these faraway places, people are like, okay, we have different priorities. So I can understand that sentiment personally. I think, like Andrew said, it's important to realize that a lot of our ability to project power and thus have the lives that we do have, though imperfect and in a lot of ways left wanting again for people in the Rust Belt, a lot of that lifestyle is underwritten by our military power. I would say additionally, though, Armenia is sort of an easy case to make in that the Armenians aren't really asking the United States for aid. Really, more than anything, they're asking for the right to purchase American weapons. So, there's actually money to be made there. And, I hadn't really gone into the situation on the ground yet, but they, following the ethnic cleansing that took place last year, they've been pivoting hard to the West, away from their traditional security guarantor of Russia. And so we have the ability now to sort of bring in a nation into our orbit that shares borders with Turkey, Iran, and Azerbaijan, and Russia just to the north. It is immensely strategically valuable. And like I said, really cultivating that relationship doesn't cost much. If anything, again, we could make money on it. Something people don't know is we've actually sent tens of millions of dollars in aid, straight up aid, to Azerbaijan over the last couple of decades. And that goes into, as Andrew was talking about, realpolitik considerations. We partner with Azerbaijan against Iran, and it's complicated, right? But, if anything, I'm not necessarily for cutting off the tap for foreign aid, but if we're going to do it, I think the first nation who we should probably turn off the spigot for is Azerbaijan, who again is responsible for this recent ethnic cleansing of 120,000 Armenians from their ancient homeland. And perhaps I can get into this a little bit later, but has continuously threatened to invade southern Armenia with the backing of Turkey.
Yeah, and that whoever most wants to address it, could you give us a little history of the Armenian peoples spread about, some of the timelines of being carved up essentially post-Soviet era, and what kind of threat exists there? It is still hard for us to grasp as Americans a lot of times, where people's ethnicity and identity and religion is so tied to a given area, but then the lines drawn on the map are not in recognition of that. And then people have faced this horrible choice of retaining that kind of raw rooted identity in the place that they're from and love versus trying to enjoy any political rights, religious freedom, even right to life, right to access to food. So it's just these really difficult choices that the accidents of history put the Armenians in.
Well, there's a question in the Q&A directed towards Andrew and probably Dan as well, but I'll briefly say that the Armenian diaspora, like the first wave of it, was in the first round of massacres called the Hamidian massacres in the late 1890s. And then, of course, the preemptively before the Armenian genocide and during the genocide. So that is why my family ended up in Egypt for about a century, because a Turkish neighbor warned my great-grandfather, things are going to get bloody for Armenians. You should probably go. And that's just on my maternal side. My paternal side has a different story, but similar. So that is why there are more Armenians outside of Armenia than in Armenia. So I think you made a reference to the diaspora. In terms of like Soviet occupation, there wasn't really much room to leave. They were stuck there for a long time. In the 90s, after Soviet collapse, we did have family that left Yerevan and came to the United States. And the difference between the Armenians who are part of the diaspora, the majority of my family, and that small minority in my family, when you talked about religious freedom, Isaac, I mean, we're so, even though we're Orthodox and Catholic Christians, evangelical about it. We can pray easily before meals, talk about God easily. The Soviet occupied Yerevan family that came to the US in the 90s are in awe of the freedom by which we express our faith, because they didn't really have that liberty under Soviet occupation. So that's an interesting kind of thing to note as well.
Yeah, and there are a couple of questions here that are excellent questions that I'd like to address one at a time and hand it off to Dan and Simon to follow up, of course. The first is, why is it that the U.S. isn't taking advantage of this opportunity to, so to speak, pull Armenia out of the Russian orbit? It's very difficult to do. You can't really pull them out of it. You have to pull them away rather than out of. But and it would be difficult. I don't know that Russia would respond well to the U.S. establishing a security partnership with Armenia that's as firm as, say, the one that we have with Poland. But that's not really on the table. All, as Dan said, we're just talking about people who are saying, we just want to defend ourselves. Please give us the means to do that. Somewhat reminiscent of what the Maronites in the late 70s were saying as their civil war was underway and the United States refused to equip Maronite Christians in Mount Lebanon as the PLO and others were trying to drive them out of Lebanon. And in one of history's ironies and the region's great ironies, it was the Israelis who equipped Maronite Christians and Catholics so that they could defend themselves. This is a really difficult problem, but I think the simple answer to the question is that most Americans simply have no idea that Armenia is a Christian nation. They don't know roughly where it is geographically or what its role is historically. There is just no sense of that, and there are a lot of people competing in that space for their attention, and the competition has won, unfortunately. And when there isn't an overriding sense among the American people that they want to support a people, a nation, the way that most American people today support Israel, when that's missing from the general public, then everything is left to lobbyists and interests and big power interests and defense interests. And in that sense, Turkey and Azerbaijan wield much more influence in Washington. So the answer for the Armenians is to make the American people aware and leverage that into policy change. And, you know, whether we're talking about 30-second ads that say, listen, our enemies want to genocide us again. This is who we are. This will continue to play out just in terms of realpolitik and power. And I think that's related to the second question, which is why has this gotten much less social response? Although that's a little bit more complicated. I would say that journalists love to write about Israeli conflict with anyone, and there are a variety of reasons for that. We could speculate about some of them. It can be as simple as journalists are very safe in Israel. They have air-conditioned hotels, and everyone likes to read negative stories about Israel and sympathetic stories about Palestinians without really much regard for deeper truths. Those are not the conditions in Armenia. It's much harder to demonize let's say a Turkish or Azeri enemy than it is to demonize the Israelis. And our public culture isn't terribly keen to make victims or heroes out of Christians, even Middle Eastern Christians. Anyone who's worked in this space understands that. It's extremely frustrating, and I think that's why we at the Philos Project find ourselves naturally more allied with Israel and Armenia and the people of those two countries.
I can hop in, Dan, unless you want to hop in first. I'll take it to a supernatural level, spiritual and cultural level, which is my, you know, where my mind and heart always actually live. When Andrew was talking about whether is it in the jurisdiction of the state to be moral, so to speak, I think another word for that would be in terms of like charity. And I would agree with Andrew that no, that charity is on the level, or sanctification, is that the word that you used, Andrew, is in the level of the church. But certainly justice, natural justice is in the values aligned with what state priorities should be. I would say that when it comes to Armenians versus Israel, everything that Andrew said, I agree with. It is fascinating on a spiritual level that there, again, a lot of an explanation to this is like really good PR, victimization, and certainly Palestinians are suffering greatly, those 30,000 or whatever the number happens to be. But when you put that next to 120,000 Armenians, wow, there's much more attention on one and then the other. Something that I appreciated about Andrew's article, which I encourage everyone to read, and I think, Isaac, thank you for posting that in the chat, is that when I try to wrap my mind around it, because there's so many layers to an answer to the question, it seems like there is such an immediate hatred towards Jews in Israel. With Armenia, there is this apathy. And it might be the way that Jew hatred is a spiritual evil. It could be a spiritual apathy towards Armenians. It's interesting that for these two Judeo-Christian countries, so to speak, the chosenness of Israel as God's chosen people to bring, as Christians, we believe, the Messiah to the entire world. The chosenness of Armenia being the world's first Christian nation. It's interesting that when you think about hatred and apathy, how you can say that those are the reasons why evil does exist, both hatred and spiritual apathy, largely. So those are kind of the things that go through my mind in terms of trying to understand it on a spiritual and supernatural level. On a natural level, I think it goes back to the idea that perhaps there is compassion or geopolitical military fatigue based on previously bad experiences in foreign policy, but also that economically speaking, Armenia doesn't have much to offer America and the West. And so to care about Armenia in the West, we really need to raise awareness. Like Andrew mentioned, most people don't exactly know where Armenia is, which is why I'm always very personally moved when people show up to Armenia-based things. Um, and we have a loss and decline of faith and religiosity and deep culture in the West. So there isn't even that reason to care about Armenia, even if she was economically prosperous or there were economic incentives to care. And Dan, I would love for you to share with us, because in the last century with the Armenian Genocide in the 20th century, which today is remembering, America and the West did care about that. And I think largely because we were in a different state spiritually and culturally. So Dan, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I am anyway.
No, yeah, I'd be happy to. I was actually planning on raising it. The during the Armenian Genocide, 1915-ish. I mean, it actually took place over a span of about 40 years, but the American church actually rallied in unprecedented fashion, sent, the modern equivalent of billions and billions of dollars in aid through civil society to the Armenian people. And in the words of one historian, I believe it is, quote, the American people quite literally saved an entire nation. So, at Save Armenia and Philos, we see our work as a continuation of that legacy, the legacy of the American church stepping up. Another really interesting point is that the American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire at the time, Ambassador Morgenthau, was Jewish, and he was one of the most vocal, persons in regards to what the Ottomans were doing to Armenians. I mean, he was really going out there and trying to draw global attention to this. The Ottomans, famously asked him, "Oh, I mean, what do you care? You're Jewish. Like, why do you care about these people being harmed?" And he said, "Well, first and foremost, I'm American, and what you're doing is horrifying." And he identified with what was happening to the Armenian people. So there's this really beautiful legacy of Christians and Jews engaging on this issue. And I know at Save Armenia and Philos, we're trying to carry on that legacy honorably. I
Thanks,
could
guys.
I could talk about other stuff too if you want.
Did you mention
Yeah.
Sarah Barton, Dan? I don't think you did.
Okay. Yeah, okay. But honestly, I only know the Spark Notes. So can I put you on the spot to give the
Well, I mean, I think it's a fascinating historical fact that the first time the Red Cross went internationally was for relief efforts for Armenian refugees in the genocide. That's pretty cool historical trivia. America's done this before, and we're not even asking it to be as dramatic as the last century. But I think, and I see, Isaac, I think Emily's question about, is there a way to galvanize Christian support for Armenians with them being a Christian nation? Yes, I think that does matter. That does matter. Raising awareness, telling the story of Armenians in America in the last century, caring about the body of Christ, especially, it is the world's first Christian nation. Noah's Ark landed in Mount Ararat. That's a spiritual heritage that belongs to all Christians. So I do think that will have cultural and political implications if we can plant those deep roots by storytelling and galvanizing the fact that we're connected to these people for so many reasons, both spiritual and practical.
Yeah, one brief point to add on that. Several of us on staff last year, I think it was, read the book by Benny Morris. The title, I'll post this in the chat, is The 30-Year Genocide, Turkey's Destruction of its Christian Minorities. And it also covers what happens to the Assyrians and Greek and others. But I think one of the interesting points about that I think it's helpful for Christians to know is even prior to any governmental support or action, a lot of the even eyewitness accounts that we had were from American missionaries. So they were English speakers out there working. It was actually already a decently sized Protestant community, or sometimes just Christian aid workers. And some of the, well, almost all the accounts they have of the genocide are just utterly harrowing. It's extremely difficult to read. But I think the hopeful part was that even then there were outposts of American goodwill, Christian goodwill at a soft power level. And I think that's something that we try to emphasize at the Philos Project and Save Armenia, that there's the solution to any of these problems on a number of issues is never merely governmental or merely spiritual or merely nonprofit aid based. It's a mixture of all these things. We believe we're called to work and live incarnationally and live out every method we have to advocate. So, when legislation comes up to help Armenia, call your congressman, have your church pray about it, consider donating and volunteering. And all of these things are aspects that we need to live out. And I think for various reasons, probably just a one-track mind that humans can get, we tend to overemphasize one of the elements. And then sides of the Christian world that are more into one or the other of that. In the progressive era, a lot of Christians began to lose their faith, their orthodoxy, small o, and delved into things like the temperance movements or other aid projects, which were, could be morally upright on their own, but then eventually lost that spiritual connection and the reality that as we struggle and give our blood and sweat and treasure to try to help others, it is also always a spiritual battle, like you're saying, and we never will fully achieve success. But that shouldn't be debilitating because we know, to use a military analogy, we're attacking on multiple fronts. We have air of the spiritual and land of the tangible, naval, whichever way makes the most sense, governmental. And there are times too when we can take up these causes and none of us in the work we know have a guarantee that it's going to be successful. Sometimes people are in periods of history where the church is advocating for a group or cause or mission, and they're persecuted or they fail, or their success is not something they see in their own generation. But I think the unique space that the Christian mindset should operate is being okay with both of that. We are neither debilitated by the weight of tragedy, we're not indifferent to it, and we're empowered to achieve what we can, knowing that it doesn't fully rely on us.
Yeah, Isaac, and sorry, Andrew, I see that you want to speak as well. You remind me of something my former priest boss said to me, which is, especially being a former high school teacher and feeling like all your efforts to educate and transmit the faith to your students is, completely pointless and meaningless sometimes because they're teenagers. But that the way of discipleship is one of the feelings of failure and rejection. And that the true condition of a sacrifice is that it does feel like a failure, but it is like the fruitfulness that does plant and water and the seeds for future generations. And when I came out to DC to do advocacy for Armenia last year, the Armenians that I met here, I said, what can my pathetic attempts do to even help this cause, when, as I think Andrew or Dan mentioned earlier, Turkey and Azerbaijan have been doing the lobbying PR thing so well for the last decade, come in at the last minute. And they said, you don't understand. Armenia has only survived because of the small efforts of Armenians perpetuated through history. And so I just wanted to, I appreciate the points that you just made, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. There's a thread that runs through three of the questions that we've gotten about the connection between America and Middle East Christians and the connectedness of Middle East Christian communities themselves. It's a hard issue. Armenia exists because it has a state, because the nation, which didn't have a state, but that identity did exist, much like, let's say, 19th century Poland, which had been carved up by three empires. It didn't exist. Armenia had been subsumed by, most recently, the Turkish Empire. And so they didn't have statehood. And much like Israel was a nation, many of them in diaspora, they did manage to form through political community a state, and that is what protects them and permits them to survive. A lot of Westerners, Americans especially, have a hard time wrapping their heads around the idea that all of the world isn't of the same Enlightenment universalist religion, that everybody doesn't have equal citizenship. But the Middle East is a really hard neighborhood, and if you want to survive, if you want to guarantee your survival, you will carve out a piece of turf, ideally one that where you have historic roots, and make a decision to stand there and survive. And Israel did that, Armenia did that, many other nations did that in the 19th and 20th centuries. Greece, for example, is a nation that existed without a state for a long time. And I should stop and say that nation, country, and state are three distinct, if related and oftentimes overlapping things. So Armenia did that. The Lebanese opted for a larger geographic country beyond Mount Lebanon, and a pluralistic one. And unfortunately, due to a variety of complicated reasons, that pluralistic model simply did not work. And there are instances where pluralism fails and where boundaries have to be drawn in order for peoples to survive, distinct peoples. And if that doesn't happen, or they don't have their own distinctive geography and state to defend, they simply cease to exist. Now, these are the hard realpolitik parts of this. A lot of the questions pertain to spiritual connection, religious roots, a sense of rootedness. I would say that if there isn't that, if that sense does not exist among the American people, then there is almost zero chance that the state is going to take actions that will help ensure the survival of that nation, whether it's Armenia or another nation. And it's also worth noting that the people talk a lot about the Israel lobby. The Israel lobby would be, there are many such lobbies, and I don't know that the lobby in DC for Israel is frankly terribly effective. There's a belief that it is, but I don't know that it is. There are other much stronger lobbies that are actually foreign lobbies that have tried to replicate what they thought the Israelis had done. The Israelis didn't really do anything. America was a philo-Semitic country from its founding. And this goes back to actually before its founding. And Christians, many have written recently on Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism today is understood as something that's some sort of end times aberrant theology with some strange eschatologies about the end of the world. That has nothing to do with the mainstream and original Christian Zionist roots, which were coming from mainline Protestantism, supported more by Christians than by American Jews. And so I say all this by way of saying it's very important. All things being equal, I think a lot of people in the US government would love to just turn their back on Israel and walk away. Israel didn't really do anything to earn the support of the American people. They just had it. They had it long before there was any idea of reforging that state, long before the Balfour Declaration. And it's because America's philo-Semitism is rooted in a strong Protestant tradition that took a deep interest in Hebrew scripture, what we call the Old Testament. that has a much that's the real explanation. Now, how Armenians and advocates for Armenia replicate that, how Armenian Americans and American Christians replicate something like that, it's much more difficult to do, but it's something along those lines that would be needed.
Yeah, so another question asked here by Margaret. What do you think Christians in the West can learn from the spirit of the Armenians who continue to fight without losing their faith after so much oppression and persecution? Yeah, I'm very curious about that too, and I'd love to hear, to the extent you guys have these relationships, how it might differ in diaspora versus those rooted there. But just through the Philos Project and trips we've done, had a chance to meet, of course, Simone, so of Egyptian extraction, Armenian, other alumni we've had from Istanbul directly, alumni woman of ours, had a fascinating history of having survived and been there for a period of time. And then America might be the most comfortable example versus those that you know in the country itself. Maybe starting with Simone there.
Yeah, I think what comes to mind immediately is if you're a Christian in the Near East, in the Middle East, you know you're a Christian if you're willing to be discriminated, persecuted, second-class citizen, have your house burned down, as a Coptic Christians in Armenia dealt with yesterday and are dealing with right now, as they approach their Holy Week next week. You know you're a Christian if you're willing to be uncompromising about holding on to your faith and your conviction. In the West, it's not as easy. It's not as easy. And it's very easy to slip into reductionistic expressions of Christianity to make Jesus a bumper sticker to your faith. I speak a lot about Christianity being reduced to ethics, moralism, sentimentality. These are really easy things to slip into when you're not in a directly persecuted state. So I think that's the one thing to recognize, is to have a deep examination of conscience in, am I living out the actual Christian faith, or the one that I get to fashion after my own image, being in a Western and free country. And the second thing is, Christianity at its heart is about a relationship and a dialogue with the divine, with God, which is always dramatic if it's, I would boldly claim, engaged deeply, right? There's a reason why Jacob's name gets changed to Israel, and that meaning wrestling with God, because he wrestled with the angel of God. The wrestling part says something about the relationship that we have with God. Our relationships in some ways should be that way, this wrestling. Or, as in the Catholic context, one of my favorite saints, Saint Teresa of Avila, said, if this is how you treat your friends, Lord, well, no wonder you have so few. I think in the Near East and the Middle East, when you're constantly being oppressed and persecuted and occupied and so forth, you cannot escape God in that way, the way that you can living in a more privileged context. So I think what you can learn is, are you living that drama and that intensity in the West? Because if not, perhaps it's not Christianity that you're entering into.
Yeah, I think the beauty of the Eastern Church and its history of being persecuted for thousands of years is their history is the great destroyer of the prosperity gospel narrative that we find in the West. The idea that if you follow Jesus, you will acquire health and wealth. And when I run into that, I will say Eastern Christianity, and people are like, what? And I'm like, you haven't studied the Eastern Church. It's just, your theology is bonkers. But I think there's just so much to learn from what it means to suffer for the Lord. One of the things I'm most excited about at Save Armenia is we're putting together an Armenian Jewish Friendship Council, of which Simone is a part. And two of our members, one Armenian, one Jewish, have talked about the idea of writing a book that basically just explores the shared pain of their communities and what it means to have, what they call pit time time living in the pit, like when, Joseph was thrown in the pit, Daniel was thrown in the pit. Like, what does it look like to follow the Lord when you're called into a time of suffering? St. Gregory the Illuminator, thrown into a pit. And so there's just so much to learn from the Eastern Church about what it actually looks like to follow Christ through suffering, which is something the West doesn't know a whole lot about, I don't think.
Yeah, very well said. Well, we're almost at time here. We want to thank everyone for joining us, and following up on mentioning of initiatives, Dan, I'd love if you could share a little about what you guys have on the horizon, places people could sign up to learn more, ways to support and to stay engaged on this issue.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned briefly, we are hoping to bring other further delegations of American Christian leaders to Armenia, to bring these leaders home and use their influence and their audience to raise awareness. And in a lot of ways, what we do is we don't necessarily lobby the government, but we lobby American culture, and hopefully policy changes run downstream of that. Additionally, we are standing up these different councils, as I mentioned, the Armenian Jewish Friendship Council, and we hope that these can be places where we foster collaboration and workshopping. Yes, this weekend, our friends at For the Martyrs are hosting the March for the Martyrs. So this rally and event will be highlighting specifically Armenia and Nigeria. If you aren't following what's happening to the church in Nigeria, I would encourage you to do so. It's also horrifying. And in terms of what can you do, ideally run for president, win, and then change US policy. That would be my request. I don't know. The thing is, I don't know I don't necessarily have one big thing to put in front of the audience in terms of what they can do. With that being said, I do think the Lord has given each of you specific skill sets, and he's put you in a specific place to influence the people around you. If you want to explore further what it means to leverage that for this issue, just reach out to me and we'll talk about it.
Yes, thanks, Dan. Yeah. I think we've all benefited a lot from hearing stories from friends, and most closely from Simone and her life story, and other resources. So I think just part of it is understanding the story, learning it, repeating it, getting it out there. Because there's a variety of ways we can affect things, but part of it is just a lot of ignorance and not understanding it. And it's the same, I think, with both genocides. The phrase "never forget" was invented for the Holocaust, but the term Holocaust itself was invented first to describe the Armenian situation. And there are so many parallels, and it's hard. It's not a fun thing to think about. It's not something that, even Christians want to dwell on in our most merciful moments, just because there's so much suffering. But the potential for evil to be repeated, I think, directly correlates with the amount of people that are aware of it and also force themselves to do that discipline of understanding it and repeating it, because every generation the human heart will be able to and fully capable of repeating age-old evils, including genocide. So glad to be a part of this community where you're all active and engaged to understand these issues. And so whether you work directly in policy or just in your daily life as a Christian trying to understand these issues, continue to spread the word, think about these things, and pray. And stay tuned for more events from us and also Save Armenia. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Guys.